20th of January. Exactly, now it popped up, so for fun. Aaron Kachuk from the University of Cambridge is going to talk also on object agency. And the session will be chaired by Elena Giusti. Chiara, you have the floor, and thank you so much again for being a speaker and being with us today. Thank you very much indeed.
Hi, thank you. So just started sharing my screen. I hope you're all fine and safe and healthy. Let me just, so, can you see my presentation?
Yeah, excellent. Very good.
So I thank you very much, Giulia Maria. I'm absolutely glad and honored to be part of this interesting series of lectures. I actually hope to give you a glimpse or a kind of little contribution to the ongoing debate that we are having in this first section of the lectures dedicated to the agency of prosthetic bodies in antiquity, with the focus with a kind of description with a short contribution on the role played by some ancient ritual objects, which not only accompanied the ritual but also perpetrated it, as we will see. So tonight we are looking at a widespread individual practice attested among almost all ancient populations throughout the Mediterranean basin and the neighboring regions, aimed at harming one or more targets and consisting in the inscribing of the target's name, often accompanied by a cursing prayer, and then laying down the inscribed object, mostly a small lead tablet, in a significant place, such as a grave or a well. We will be focusing on the carriers of the cursed inscriptions after having looked at the figurines, which sometimes were laid down along with the tablet or could even replace it by being themselves inscribed. Such plastic and iconic tools of the cursing ritual have been namely long referred to by scholarship as the embodiment of the principles upon which magic was believed to be working in pre-modern societies. You will surely know the very first attempt to explain ancient so-called magical practices. I'm very reluctant in using the term magic and magical, but I just report what scholars say. The first attempt was that of James Fraser, who introduced the concept of sympathy, that is, the like produces the like, as either a contagious or a homeopathic process by which the ritual items were believed to concretely transfer their properties. In the case of cursing dolls, for instance, they're being bound or crooked or twisted or pierced and so on. We will see a couple of images very soon. So to transfer these properties onto the victims because of their analogy and according to an erroneous understanding of causality in nature on part of the practitioners. This approach, that of James Fraser, was famously then kind of adapted or corrected by Stanley Tambaya, who tried to clarify on what precisely consists the type of analogy principle ruling over such rituals. He conveniently regarded the ritual objects in combination with the gestures and the speeches accompanying them and introduced the theory of persuasive analogy, by which the power of transferring given features from the ritual items to the target arises from the formulas completing the ritual, the spoken formulas, and more broadly from the whole ritual complex in which these very objects were embedded. More recently, Derek Collins has kind of rethought the role of ritual images in the context of ancient Greek religious practices, and more specifically of cursing dolls, by recovering the notion of social agency. as it was elaborated by Alfred Gell to illustrate human idolatry, we'll come back to this term, in its etymological sense of fruition of idols, idolatry. Idols, and with idols, it basically calls every kind of ritual artifact in the context of an anthropological theory of representational art. I will first briefly summarize Collins' conclusions on the social agency of cursing figurines, and afterwards I will come to Gell in order to highlight a few points that, in my opinion, were somehow neglected by Collins, but can instead be made fruitful in order to revise and expand the concept of social agency within ancient religious practices. In a substantial paper appeared 2003, which anticipated the core of his book, which would then have appeared in 2008, Derek Collins elaborates three main theses, which are supposed to illustrate how ancient Greek magic was meant to work in the eyes of the people of the time. First, that already since the pre-Socratic philosophy, the idea which prevailed even since pre-Socratic philosophy, that divine influence was believed to be intrinsic in any element of the physis, so that the gods were capable of affecting anything in the world, however and whenever they wanted to. The second pillar of ancient magic, according to Collins, was the admission of the possible concurrence or even identity of mechanical and volitional causality, so that to explain an accident with an empiric cause did not prevent from presuming an intention or a volition from either another person or a divinity as having determined that very accident. Like, you know, the harvest of a farm was completely ruined. Think of of a farmer whose harvest was completely ruined by a wild storm, that he, of course, the mechanical immediate cause of that would be that wild storm, but then he might have kind of ascribed the storm itself to a kind of bad will or sort of curse, from, or bad will again, from either coming from either another person, an enemy, or from a god. So these two explanations did not kind of clash against each other, or were not excluded themselves. Did not exclude each other. And the third and for us most relevant thesis by Collins attempts to answer the question of how ritual figurines were believed to operate. In order to do so, he retrieves the concept of social agency, which was formulated by the British anthropologist Alfred Gell in his seminal work, appeared shortly after his death, and entitled Art and Agency. We will come back to this very soon. Collins suggests that the little voodoo dolls employed in ancient curses can be put on a par with cut statues of the god, the so-called Xoana. Statues, as well as along with statues which human fell in love with, according to the stories, to the records of this that we have in literary sources, like the famous story of Pygmalion and the ivory statue, which was then animated by Venus, so that he fell in love with the statue. All such stories, and also along with children's dolls and puppets, especially those dedicated by girls and boys in sanctuaries. So that you have a sort of whole spectrum of social agents, of figurines acting as social agents in the ancient world, be they statues, divine statues, be they these statues being treated or becoming humans, as well as dolls and puppets. What does then the social agency of these idols, as Gell will call them, concretely mean? Collins defines social agency as the property of objects to act or be treated like a human. Please bear in mind this definition. The property of objects to act or be treated like a human, like a person. As witnesses of this treatment of effigies like persons, Collins quotes, for instance, the well-known practice of divine statues as being fed, being clean, being dressed up. Think of the peplos, which was put on Athena's statues at each Panathenaion, as well as being taken to trial. We even have instance of this. And especially he recalls the famous story of Theagenes of Thasos, as it is reported by Pausanias, according to which the statue of this dead local hero was found guilty by the Thasian judges, found guilty of murder of an enemy of Theagenes, who kept outraging the statue by flogging it at night, and then died having been hit by the statue that had fallen on him. And then on trial, the statue was actually found guilty of murder. And this is what Collins considers an ideal example of social agent. Since Theagenes Kolossos, and here I quote Collins, is effectively a human being and is therefore, from the functional viewpoint of the relevant community, treated like one, end of quote. Collins then applies this notion of to the figurines used in cursive rituals, and here you have a few examples, which, like Theagenes' statue, were considered capable of, and I quote, injury and retribution, if not of movement, end of quote. A few dozens of such voodoo dolls from different areas of the ancient Mediterranean basin have survived until nowadays, although we have to guess that they were quite more frequent than what has come to us, since they could be made not only of lead, bronze, or clay, like the instances, like the witnesses that have survived to us, but also of wax, wood, or wool, which has much more perishable materials. The figurines often have their limbs and legs bound or twisted behind their backs. Some were pierced by nails. Occasionally, the figurines were laid inside miniature coffins as if they were corpses. You have instances of all these practices on this slide. When it comes to the question of why the figurines are bound, the usual answer invokes the Fraserian sympathy, in combination with Tambay's definition of persuasive analogy. Instead, Collins proposes to move away from analogical thinking inherent in Fraser and Tambay's approaches in order to grasp the attitude ancient people had towards these ritual objects, which he claims were regarded as agents. To back up this assumption, Collins recalls Plato's remark on the two forms with which gods could be worshipped. In the Laws, Plato states, namely, that some of them can be directly identified with the senses, like for instance the stars, while others can only be indirectly worshipped through their images, eikonas, agalmata, which in themselves are apsychoi, but can be filled with the divine spirits and thus become empsychoi. This reminds us of the pre-Socratic idea that anything which is capable of motion, to move or to cause motion, in both senses, is filled with a psyche. This comes from the idea of, from the long-standing debate on the motion of magnets that had, that is attested all along in several fragments from the pre-Socratic philosopher, beginning from Thales. And they explained this energy, the movement of magnets as stones being filled with psyche. So anything which is capable of motion must have inside itself a psyche. Collins thus argues that when effigies were bound, like in the case of the famous binding of Ares in the Ares statue, in order to prevent war from breaking out. Such gesture was not analogical, but concretely aimed at preventing the idola from moving. Applied to the cursing figurines, this means that, and here I quote two conclusive statements by Collins. The first one is from the 2003 paper. In the creation of magical figurines, there is nothing fundamentally sympathetic or persuasive at issue, nor is there anything symbolic at issue. It is not for the sake of symbolism that one feeds figurines, but because that is how they eat. That is, the binding of a figurine is the binding of its agency, not a symbolic or persuasive act, whether that agency is actualized in movement or in some other form. End of quote. The second thought develops further on the previous one, the one that I've just read, and it's from his monograph of 2008. And there Collins says, magical figurines were abused through twisting and binding, not as symbolic acts, but literally to arouse their anger. In turn, it was expected that they would somehow discharge their anger on the intended victim or victims, hence the need to write their names and the desired curse on the figurine or on its coffin. After all, the figurines needed to know whom to attack. End of quote. This is a completely unheard and new identification of the cursing dolls as a sort of fourth category of agents within a curse, beside the cursor, the cursed, and the gods. So he creates a sort of fourth category of supernatural entities being embodied by the dolls. And it's quite surprising because he reports this kind of argument as a kind of shared opinion in scholarship with no reference or evidence whatsoever for it. And it's totally unheard, since the common interpretation of these dolls is that they represented or embodied, if you follow, the idea of social agency, the target of the curse, so the cursed people. Here, I wonder, but I leave it as a kind of thought of mine to you to reflect upon. Here, I wonder whether Collins he got somehow confused and identified the cursing figurines, or identified, he put on a par the cursing figurines with the effigies of Eros, the so-called erotes, that actually, according to Lucian, but also in several passages of the PGM, of the Papyri Graecae Magicae, are meant to, had to be shaped to fulfill erotic spells. So in several recipes for erotic spells, we find that that the practitioners of these spells, that the cursors or the practitioners of these spells had to shape, along with all the other tasks that they had to complete in order to fulfill this erotic spell. They also had to shape, to mold figurines of Eros that, of course, in that case, did indeed have to act as a sort of intermediary figure in order to put into action, to concretize the spell. So I wonder whether here he got somehow confused, that identified even these types of dolls, which have nothing to do, or at least which have only partly to do with erotic spells, with this kind of spirits. even though, as I said, these figurines do not necessarily, or only partly, were found along with inscriptions of erotic curses, of erotic spells. They could be found. They were used for any kind of curse. Beside this rather circumscribed problem, on the whole, I would agree with Collins' approach in viewing ancient cursing figurines as social agents. Nevertheless, I believe that some aspects should be revised, which have mainly to do with how Collins somehow misread or partly overlooked Gell. In the remaining time, I just wish to quickly go back to Collins' source of inspiration and then suggest a slight redefinition of how I would apply the concept of social agency with reference to ancient cursing practices. While reading chapter 7 of Alfred Gell's book, the one devoted to the topic of social agency in idolatry, and with idolatry, as I said, we mean the very etymological sense of the fruition of an artifact, I realized that Collins was not as true to his source as one would believe. There are two main points which in my opinion were either misinterpreted or neglected by Collins in his adoption of Gell's anthropological method. By the way, there's also at least one further minor point in which Collins moved away or disagreed somehow from Gell's definition of a social agent, but since it's not specifically relevant to for my talk, I will skip it. We can talk about it in case you're interested in this third point of disagreement. First, so the two main points. First one. When defining what makes an artifact a social agent, Gell clearly states that the issue of likeness to the model, we call it a model, that is how much an idol has to resemble a human being in both its appearance and its behavior in order to be a social agent, is totally irrelevant. In other words, whether an idol is iconic or aniconic does not matter for it to be regarded as a social agent. As Gell puts it, and I quote, "Idols are not depictions, nor portraits, but artifactual bodies." Or shortly ahead, "The idol is not a depiction of the god, but the body of the god in artifact form." End of quote. This releases us from the discomfort felt by Collins when he comes to the unsolvable issue of how much an effigy has to resemble its original, let me use these terms, in order to become its agent. Since it's undeniable that there was no striving at all in shaping the voodoo dolls as similar as possible to the targets, as you can see. How then Gell defines that which makes an object a social agent? And this is the second point. If you remember, Collins defined it as that which acts or is treated like a person. But Gell writes something pretty different. Namely that, and I quote, "The object is animate not because we attribute biological life to it, but subjectivity or intentionality." He further explains this statement by quoting Pascal Boyer's concept of intentional psychology. Boyer claims, namely, that the projection of human features on something else consists in a projection of intentional psychology, and that such projection of intentional psychology does not necessarily imply a projection of any other human quality. Gell elaborates further on this by stating that, and I quote, "Social agents can be drawn from categories which are as different as chalk and cheese, because social agency is not defined in terms of basic biological attributes, but is relational." You have this quotation also. "It does not matter in ascribing social agent status what a thing is in itself. What matters is where it stands in the network of social relations. All that may be necessary for stocks and stones to become social agents in the sense that we require is that there should be actual human persons, agents, in the neighborhood of these inert objects. This last remark sounds quite cryptic or secular, to me at least. Indeed, it's obvious that it is the community which ascribes a role of social agent to a given item, and it's not the artifact itself which acquires it by itself. Elsewhere, Gell attempts to be more accurate in outlining the ways in which the attribution of social agency can take place. These are essentially twofold. There's an external way, which indicates that the idol has to be set in a specific relational texture of social practice and language. So there must be a context, and this is the previous point, basically. But then there's also the internal way, which has to work. And this internal way of attribution of social agency presupposes a belief that what Gell calls homunculus can inhabit the body of the idol. And this is a kind of simply a simple reframing of the already recalled Platonic view of the visible body object as a sort of vessel container of the soul. A careful reading of Gell requires us to revise Collins' adoption of the theory of social agency in ancient religion in 2 points. First, the appearance of the ritual object is secondary, if not irrelevant. Second, a social agent is not defined by its being treated like a person. What matters is the belief in its intentionality or volition. As a consequence of this, all those activities such as feeding, dressing, and so on, which Collins deems so distinctive of social agents, are not essential, not least because such behaviors could be explained also in terms of play and fictionality, which would bring us back to analogy, to the topic of analogy. Gell himself warns the reader from falling into the trap of identifying social agency with anthropomorphic thinking, which on a behavioral sense means treating objects like persons. Anthropomorphic thinking is an innate cognitive bias that we all carry in ourselves and cannot remove and apply constantly, more or less wittingly. Think of, speaking to your car, to your computer when they don't want to work, or things like that. This is why I do not agree with Collins that to treat an object like a person and to believe that an object can act like a person are equivalent. They are not. Now, with a more precise understanding of what a social agent is and does, we can try to improve its application to ancient cursing artifacts, which can indeed be very fruitful. What I suggest to do is to regard the figurines not as the social agents in cursing rituals par excellence, but as one particular category of social agents, whose most numerous witnesses were the cursed tablets themselves. This intuition can be found already in Gell's book, although not yet in its full implication. As an example of the aniconicity of social agents in cursing ritual, he mentions precisely the ancient curse tablets. Let us read these few lines taken from Gell. The ancient Greeks used to sorcerai. I confess this is the first time I came across this verb. I didn't know it existed. So the ancient Greeks used to sorcerize one another by taking small pieces of lead on which they would scratch the name of the victim and the words, I bind, before burying them in the ground. This would cause the victim to sicken and die. The comparison with vault sorcery, this is how he calls cursing rituals, basically, which uses the image of the victim in place of the inscribed lead, is interesting, in that it suggests that visual representation and binding and naming are essentially akin to one another. So visual representation and binding are essentially akin to one another, he says. And he goes on, the words I bind, provide a bridge between the linguistic side of magic, they are words, and the physical side of magic. They refer to a physical operation carried out on the body of the victim. End of quote. What Gell here is implicitly saying is that in the mind of practitioners of curses, there was no difference between a figurine and an inscribed lead tablet in their agency, so that we can safely count cursed tablets too as social agents. In order to do so, we have to get rid of Collins' identification between the belief on the social agency of an object and anthropomorphic thinking. In the end, it's not that hard to achieve, since we have to remind ourselves that the agency ascribed to those ritual tools was not a human agency, but a divine one. The texts inscribed on cursed tablets support, in my opinion, this view, especially those formulaic performative predicates in the first person singular, such as the most frequent one, the formula katado, I bind in Greek, which we have already found mentioned in the Gell's passage just quoted. These performative predicates, I bind so and so, refer to the effect of the tablet on the victim, who is bound to the fate of the ritual object by having his or her name written down on it. In the binding formula, the mental process on the basis of which the curses projects their target onto the written medium is an essential prerequisite for the emergence and successful circulation of these very formula, I would argue. According to it, the scratching, the folding, the nailing, the piercing, and the burring of the cursed tablet coincide in the imagination of the performer of a cursing ritual with the crippling, the paralysis up to the death of the cursed. So the kind of manipulations that were practiced on these tablets do indeed coincide with the kind of harms that were wished in these texts. If one attempts to reconstruct a kind of genealogy of the formulaic locutions of cursing, it seems reasonable to assume that they emerge from those direct actions which were performed on the written medium, on the tablets, both during the writing act and with the subsequent manipulations of the tablet. First, the writing down of the cursed text, and especially the name of the victim, often written backwards or with shuffled letters and all these kind of manipulations, which was then buried, must have inspired the formula of binding down. The other formulaic predicates in the first person must have developed building upon this very first analogy. Let me use this term. Parallel to the binding formula, attested as early as the 6th century BC, the predicate catagrafo, along with its variants grafo and engrafo, as well as its Latin counterparts scribo and describo, expressing the etching of the surface of the tablet with the victim's name, illustrates the close relation between the fate of the cursed tablet and that of the victim. The predicate not only denotes the simple act of writing down a name, but also represents a physical intervention in the life of the named person. As I've tried to prove elsewhere, this occurs on two semantic levels. Firstly, through the same analogy as Catador as the one that Catador conveys, namely in that the recording of the cursed prayer on a material support equates the binding of the cursed person. And secondly, the act of scratching the tablet recalls the wounding of the victim, as if the written surface was their skin, was their flesh. The other pragmatic predicates can be explained in a similar way. When the cursor wrote Catorusso, ai bari, Catapassaleo, I nail down, or affanizzo, I let disappear, they meant that the burying, the nailing, and the destruction of the victim took place via the corresponding manipulations of the tablet. The fact that first-person predicates are directly linked to the material and visual features of the tablet is particularly conspicuous in an Attic-led tablet of the 4th century BC. 4th century BC. Each target of this curse, which is connected to a legal dispute, is followed by a binding formula and a list of body parts and other belongings of each victim. We don't have no time to read the whole text, but you have it in front of you. The curse ends with a first-person formula listing a series of attacks on the victims altogether, lines 16 to 18. I wish to emphasize the close relationship between the predicates and the actions that were performed on the lamella, the writing down, the burying, and the nailing. This tablet was too nailed and had holes on the surface left by the nailing down. The cursed are bound by writing down the curse. They are buried because the tablet was laid in a grave. They are made invisible because with its burial, the tablet disappeared. And they are nailed down because nails have been driven into the tablet several times. Fritz Graf has already explained this source in similar terms, and I quote him now. The curse...
Chiara, I'm so very sorry.
I'm really finished.
Ah, okay, cool.
Yeah,
Wonderful.
It's really the last very few lines.
Wonderful, thank you.
Sorry. This is what Graf also comments on this text. The cursor summarizes what he's doing to his victim. And he translates, these all I bind, I make disappear, I bury, I nail into the depths. This list refers to a ritual sequence whose object is not the victim of the defixio, but the lead tablet itself. First, it is bound, then it is made to disappear, it is buried, it is nailed. These implicit analogies are immediately reminiscent of the category of similia similibus formulas, those formulae similes whose comparandum is some part of the curse and ritual. However, and here comes the social agency of the tablets into play, all these I formulas do not prospect some future event. Rather, they enact the concrete material perpetration of the curse. Through the I formulas, the carriers of the written curses behaved like dolls. Even though they do not portray the targets, the tablets containing the names of the curse and on which various torture-like manipulations were carried out acted like the embodiment of their targets and can therefore, just like the dolls, be considered social agents. I'll finish here. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed for this wonderful paper. I personally took many notes. Yes, please, if you have any questions, feel free to ask them. Yeah, well, then I actually have a question, and it would be, this figurine are, the binding of the figurine you explained so nicely is meant to, is equal the binding of their agency, if I understood correct.
Mm-hmm.
So my question would be, are then those figurines also deemed to be alive, I mean, empsychos? Or is the point that you so nicely put in the slide, volition, it's not equal biological life?
Precisely. I mean, I think there's a kind of, I mean, I struggle myself in kind of not thinking of these objects or of the mental process, you know, of attributed social agency as being or as the same kind of process that we have when we attribute anthropomorphic features to objects. These are two distinct things, and it's very hard. It's very, I mean, at least to me, it's very hard to kind of detach, you know, to get these two things distinct from each other as a mental exercise, you know. Volition and will to act, and volition and intention are not necessarily, or do not have to be human, you know, do not have to come from a human. So that and with this also the question of whether they were meant to be alive or not is not relevant any longer, you know. I don't know if you could follow my.
Yeah, because you mean, for example, even gods obviously have volition,
Yes.
but they are not necessarily alive because they never die.
Yeah.
This
and the same goes for, yeah, and I mean, of course, I mean, this thing which Collins says, that these figurines were meant to be some kind of agents other than the victims. The common you know, idea is that the figurines basically embodied the victims, because of course the kind of tortures that were done on these figurines, you know, make kind of immediate, you know, this identification. And so I was myself very struck when I read, and as I said, I had since Collins gave no kind of reference to where he took this idea that these figurines were actually not the victims, but some other thing, some other entity, you know, some kind of intermediary entity, which had to kind of to make the intermediary, you know, to kind of act, to kind of bring the message, to kind of perpetuate and also put into action the curse. I was unable to kind of follow this line of thought, because it just put it there and he doesn't say anything else about it. And he gives no references. So that the only thing which came to my mind, as I said already during the talk, was that he might have kind of switched, you know, or got confused between these figurines and the erotes, that indeed had to be shaped, you know, when doing an erotic spell. And in that case, of course, they are intermediary. But in that case, they are not bound, they are not twisted, they're not, you know, nailed, and so on. So they are there. They are recognizable as erotes.
Yeah. And even in that case, one can argue if they are considered to be alive or not.
Yeah, as usual.
As usual, exactly. Yeah. Thank you very much. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
I would have more questions, but obviously, I'm sure there are.
There's one hand raised. I see. Stuart.
Hi, thank you, Sara. That was a really fascinating paper. Thank you very much. And timely for me, because I'm thinking about agency and curse tablets at the moment as well. So this is really helpful. I always go around in circles reading stuff about object agency and archaeology, and I end up tying myself in knots in my head of trying to get through it and whether I think objects have agency. And I'm still not sure what I think, but your paper is helping me clarify a little bit. My more specific question is whether this is as much about the curse tablets and the dolls having their own agency as it is about them being a way for the person placing the curse to extend their own agency. So this is a way for them to tap into divine agency or magical agency or whatever, however we want to talk about it, tap into these kinds of other sorts of power to be able to do stuff they can't do otherwise. So, for example, you know, win a legal case that otherwise they would probably lose, or get back stolen objects that otherwise would be completely lost to them, or something. So yes, that's my question, is whether this is about extending human agency rather than ascribing agency to material objects.
Well, I mean, at first, I kind of thought you would go into the, you know, your question at the beginning sounded like you were going to the direction of, you know, cathartic kind of things. This is not the case. This is really clear. It has been really rejected as an idea, no? So that all this stuff was not kind of produced in order to kind of get free, you know, and get all the anger and all the you know, out of oneself. So this kind of things has been properly rejected. So it's not the kind of thing. You mean like in a more active sense? So the extension of human agency in the sense of not throwing the feelings into these texts and into these so getting rid of the feelings, but rather kind of actively doing something when you're in a, yes, but I mean, it's clear. I think this is the more rational, you know, the more rational way of viewing this phenomenon as a whole. The thing is, as Plato says, people actually believe that this stuff worked. So and you know, when he, you know, the famous passage from the Laws where he distinguished between pharmakeia and goetheia, and he says goetheia works precisely because people persuade each other that these things are possible. So in this sense, I think this idea of expanding the human agency and saying these were kind of tools to get active by themselves are rather more exoteric views of the thing rather than esoteric ones. So the way they saw these practices and these rituals were actually really to involve the gods, you know, and get them and catch them and force them to act for them. So of course the two things, you know, kind of merged together. But I think that their way of viewing this was really, you know, these things, these objects, these rituals are powerful for themselves, don't, you know, and not the other way around. But it's really hard to say. I mean, it's as always, you know, the problem of which perspective you take, whether you take the internal or the external perspective.
Thank you very much. Sorry, I was totally following you, but it might look like I was distracted because my daughter just turned up.
Yeah, I know the problem. Hi.
Yeah, no, thank you very much. I think that's helpful. Absolutely.
Here's Penny.
Yes, here's Penny.
Hi.
Hi. Are there further questions or remarks?
I actually had a question, if that's all right. Yeah. Thank you so much for that paper. It was fabulous. So yeah, I'm doing my PhD on cursed tablets at the moment, so it's really helpful. Thank you so much. And my question kind of builds on Stuart's a little bit, but it kind of in a not on top of, like, sideways way maybe. But I was just thinking about cursed tablets, you know, that don't directly invoke the gods or the restless dead. And if I've understood correctly, there's this idea that the actions on the tablet are almost having an impact simultaneously. And it just kind of made me wonder whether the power of the curse and of the ritual, is that coming through the ritual actions, you think, as well as them having a kind of impact on the victim? Does that make sense, my question, or is it a bit jumbled?
Can you please repeat I mean, I got the first part, the second part. I mean, you say, please, yeah, sorry.
Yeah, so I was just wondering whether this ritual action was where the power of the curse came from, or whether it was more, the ritual action was more important for the outcome on the victim, and whether they were two separate things, or whether they were like two ideas. So the ritual action was having an impact as well as providing the power, or whether they were actually separate ideas in the mind of the kind of curse creator.
Well, I mean, you know, the prompt to put into action, to perform this kind of ritual must have been, as I said, the conviction that this kind of things could work. So I think it presupposes the action in itself, you know, the whole ritual. Yeah, otherwise, why would you do this? I mean, the alternative would be, yes, it's like, you know, I'm not superstitious, but still, you know, I don't know, I try to avoid being crossed by a black cat, like stuff like this. So I think this is again a kind of modern attitude towards this kind of beliefs. I think really that most of the people, I mean, when we read the you know, the critic, you know, which is uttered by Plato against, you know, claimed against all these practices as something really, you know, to be condemned. This is the point of view of a highly intellectual person, which do not reflect, you know, at all the actual beliefs and practices of the majority of the people. And the very fact that he insists so much, Plato and Pliny and so on, you know, and Pliny and so on, that they insist so much on how bad it is, you know, doing these things, proves that it was actually really widespread. And we have the proof of this because of the, you know, of the extremely high number of texts, of sources that came to us. So I think it presupposes, I mean, there was indeed the idea that these things are effective in themselves, and anyway, and the thing was precisely this, that anytime something happened, something wrong happened to someone, they did indeed first thought about whether someone had something against them, even before, you know, asking themselves whether that was an accident, that was, you know, accidental. I think that they indeed kind of try to I think that accidental, the idea of the accidental was not primary, you know, when something wrong happened. And people tended to kind of look for the cause, and as I said, mechanical causation and volitional causation were not, you know, did not exclude each other.
Thank you. Thank you.
Are there further questions or remarks?
If I may.
Yes, please.
Sorry. Yes. It was a very interesting paper, and thank you very much, Sarah. What I want to ask you is, I think the idea of seeing the tablet as an agency does work, but I wonder if it works with all kinds of tablets. And so I'd like to ask you if you'd correlate this idea to any specific kinds of tablets. And what I think about in the first place is, I think, was it Versner's idea that there are at least two fundamentally different kinds of curse tablets. The curse tablets par excellence, the prototype, which could also be called the magical type of curse tablets, and what Versner called praise for justice, which fundamentally weren't magical. But, and if so, I mean, what's the difference? So it's the same medium in a way, but in one case, in your case, it could be endowed with its proper agency, but in the case of curse of prayers for justice, it would seem that the lead plate is just a letter.
Thank you very much, Boris, because your question allows me to get actually to the very conclusion of my paper, which I had to skip because of the time. Because I mean, Collins essentially tries to move one step further than the idea of analogy, you know, of persuasive analogy as a kind of overarching rule, overarching mental pattern, you know, governing these rituals. And he says, no, there's also this idea of agency there. So the object and the ritual had a power for themselves. And it was not just a matter of saying, if this is like this, then, you know, this should happen to, you know, X. So what I would suggest to say is that analogy and agency, again, do not exclude each other. So there is indeed proof that the principle of analogy worked as well in the case of curse texts and more generally, you know, of magical texts and rituals. So persuasive analogy and agency are kind of complementary to each other. Especially in the case of what you say, you know, of the kind of texts which have more the character, which resemble more a prayer in comparison to other. I'm afraid I almost wrote an entire book. I mean, I wrote an entire book in which I kind of, in which one of the main aims is actually to kind of get rid of this distinction between actual curses and prayers for justice. But I understand that this kind of categorization is very helpful, and that this distinction is definitely, you know, useful for us to kind of distinguish between those texts that are more direct, like the ones that I've presented here, the one that I presented here, and those in which the presence of the divinity and the request for action to the divinity is more, you know, conspicuous.
Yeah.
And in that case, you would say, yeah, in that case, in those texts which look more like prayers, the analogy principle would be kind of overarching, you know, would be kind of predominant over the agency thing. Whereas, you know, in those texts in which there's more directness, you know, in the action. We would rather see more, I would rather see more agency than analogy. But as I said, they do not exclude each other. And my personal take is that those texts in which agency is really, you know, really those tablets whose inscriptions do reveal the agency of the tablets most, are precisely those tablets in which we only have the names, the list of names, without any other kind of syntactic or linguistic element, you know, beside the simple name of the target, because there the work, let's say, is done completely by the tablet. So there's no textual linguistic apparatus there. There's the simple tablet with the names. So the work, the magical work, so the supernatural work is done by the tablet, and it's interesting. And just this, when I wrote this paper, I mean, the occasion, you know, the chance to write this paper for today's lecture has brought me to that, indeed, to the thought, to this thought. And until now, you know, a few days ago, I used to think that the kind of complementary, you know, role played by, I mean, when we have, you know, simple name lists, you know, without any other content, written content, I used to think that the ritual, I mean, a spoken prayer, spoken curse would have had to accompany, you know, the ritual of the laying down of the tablet, and it might even be so. I mean, so that the kind of linguistic part of the curse was left to the simple oral, oral pronunciation of it. Whereas now, I wonder whether we shouldn't think, you know, that, or we shouldn't. Why we shouldn't think that this complementary role, next to, you know, this complementary role, wasn't played by the tablets themselves. So that there wasn't even the need to kind of speak out the cursing words, because the tablet was already doing the work. So it's just very you know, an idea which came to me now, you know, while preparing this paper. But we could even, you know, and there's indeed some scholars who said, why do we have to, and Martin is among us, why do we have to suppose that the prayers, you know, had to be spoken, had to be, you know, told aloud, you know, or told, and in any case, along with the laying down of the tablets. And indeed, I mean, we could see in the tablet the kind of the agents of this curse, without necessarily thinking of an oral, you know, of an oral speaking out, of the speaking out of the curse, as a complementary, necessary, as a necessary complement to the ritual.
Yeah, but I mean, it's just a remark and not very constructive. But I'm really wondering whether, to what extent it makes sense to ask such or try to give such definitive answers, because to me it seems that this, since this practice lasted for such a long period of time and was so widespread, that it must have varied to such a huge extent that almost anything we say about it must have been true in any particular specific locality. and yeah, so, and at the same time, almost anything we say might be wrong in other cases. Yeah. Thank you.
I thank you.
I think we have time for a last question, if there is a further one.
Irene.
Irene?
Yeah, sorry, trying to starting my video. Okay.
Hi, Irene. Hi.
Hi, nice to see you all.
Yeah, me too.
And thank you for your paper. My question is about what you just said. Very interesting, this idea of the tablet as having agency while not having any other words around it. And I'm wondering how do you interpret the function of listing names? So like the accumulation of people on the same tablet, and so what do you think about the act of listing?
Yeah, this is thank you, Irene. Yeah, I mean, again, a tablet is not a person, is not an individual. Yeah, so again, it's very hard. I myself struggle the whole time, you know, in kind of not of thinking that agency means that these things were actually embodied persons. So no, they are still tablets. So I mean, this just to kind of with this, I just want to say that the possibility of listing more than one name was given, and does not necessarily, you know, contrast with this idea of viewing tablets as agents. So you didn't have to have one tablet per person, you know, in order to identify a tablet as an agent. And the listing, yeah, is one of the most problematic topics, I guess. You know, when you look for, I mean, when you study, you know, the language of these texts. So now trying to get to focus on the text and not on the material. It's one of the most complicated things, I guess. At least to me, to explain. Because we tend to, I mean, we would not, at least perhaps in our view, you know, it's kind of counterproductive, you know, to kind of accumulate so many people in one, you know, so that you would have to think that the kind of agency and the energy, you know, of the magical, of the ritual, you know, had to divided into the whole, you know, among all the targets, so that you would have such an effective kind of curse. But then I don't know if you I mean, Gail also treated this topic, and Collins hints at it. They talk about the fractal person. And it's another anthropological topic, anthropological, you know, concept, which means that, you know, people, the individual can multiply themselves, and they apply it to the idols and say they can multiply, you know, they can multiply themselves. I haven't reflected too much upon this. I would just say that that one thing which helps us in better understanding lists is that almost all the time you can recognize one main target. So very often there is indeed a list, but there is kind of always, you know, it can be identified, you know, who's the main target of the curse, and the other people kind of come along because they are somehow involved, you know, in the issue at stake, but this is something which helps me a little bit in understanding, you know, why you would list so many people on just one tablet. But yeah, these are just, you know, random thoughts, and there's no clear, I mean, in my mind, I haven't come to any clear explanation of why you would either the only thing would be kind of very barely material, you know, very practical reasons of lack of, you know, lead, or lack of space and time, and just kind of doing, you know, kind of performing the ritual in the quickest and most economic way. This would be the most practical, perhaps, explanation for it, but I don't know.
Thank you.
So unfortunately, we are already 15 minutes over. So I have now the unpleasant job of ending the discussion. Thank you everyone for joining in, for questions and remarks, and thank you Sara, really so much for such paper, for such good paper. Yeah, I wish you all a pleasant evening, and see you soon.
Bye, thank you everyone.
Sara, mi è piaciuto tantissimo